speakers and partners. So just to welcome you all, my name is John Hurley. I'm the Chief Executive of Kilkenny Chamber, and I'm delighted on behalf of all the chambers in the Southeast to be welcoming you here today. Brexit has happened. It's a reality now, and there's lots of learnings to be shared over the last couple of weeks. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to our partners today, PwC and Roisin Purcell, tax partner there, to introduce our speakers and panel of experts and hear what they have to say. Over to you, Roisin.
Okay, thanks, John. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our event, Brexit and Beyond. And just to discuss the reality of Brexit for Southeast businesses, I want to thank John Hurley and Kilkenny Chamber of Commerce, who were very supportive in terms of hosting this event. It's a kind of a follow-on event to one we did before Christmas, when we didn't really know what was happening with Brexit. So we're in a better place now. The agreement has been signed, but there are still a lot of issues and a lot of learnings for everybody. So it's just to go through those. Chambers have been very keen to support us in this event, and that is Kilkenny Chamber, as I said, Waterford Chamber, Wexford Chamber and Tipperary Chamber, and we're all working together to really support businesses in the Southeast, because we see that this is an area where there's lots of queries. The chambers are getting queries on, so I think it's great that all the chambers are working together to with ourselves to support business. In terms of the speakers, I'm if you don't know me, I'm Roisin Purcell. I'm a tax director in the Kilkenny office. Well, when I'm in the office, working from home at the moment, but Kilkenny, Waterford and Wexford are our Southeast offices, and I'm a tax director there. I'm here today with John O'Loughlin, who's our customs partner from the PwC Dublin office. And again, John looks after customs issues for clients all over the country and is very busy at the moment. I also have with me Brian Hogan. Brian is my colleague in the Southeast in VAT. He's our VAT expert, and VAT does feature in some of the issues to think about with Brexit. So we just brought Brian in to give a kind of a high-level overview of what the key issues are. And I'm delighted as well to have with us Annie Flahavan of E. Flahavan and Sons. Annie is a 7th-generation Flahavan family member. The business is, I'm sure everybody's aware of it, in Kilmacthomas in County Waterford, a great Southeast family business. Annie is the financial controller there. They have a massive business on selling oat-based, basically food products. They export to 20 different countries, and the UK market is a significant market for them. So I think it'll be just really interesting to hear Annie's Brexit story in terms of their preparations and what the issues are that they're seeing at the moment. So so that's us. We'll move on with the show, and I'm going to start off by asking John a question. If we go back to the 24th of December, John, and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was signed, everybody was really happy to finally have an agreement. Can you just kind of give us your views on what actually was agreed, and also give us an overview of some of the key issues and how they relate to Ireland?
Thanks, Roisin, and good afternoon to everybody wherever in the world you might be, or the country where you might be today. As Roisin said, the TCA was published on the 24th of December, and what a day to publish any type of piece of legislation, Christmas Eve. And while we're all hunkering down to, wait for Santa Claus to make a long-awaited appearance, I felt like I got a lump of coal down the chimney when presented with 1,300 pages of the TCA, knowing at some point over the Christmas break that was going to be my reading. Not any biographies, not any crime thrillers, but the TCA as it was published. So certainly I felt a little bit aggrieved with the publication on that date, given that I had been waiting for it for probably about 5 years, as the negotiations kind of trundled on from June 2016, when the UK decided to leave the European Union. The document as it's published, I suppose to give a bit of housekeeping around it, now has provisional effect, and the European Council gave that provisional effect on the 29th of December. It hasn't yet been ratified by the EU at this stage, and interestingly enough, over the last coming days, or over the recent days, we've actually heard the ratification process is going to be extended, potentially out until April. Now, is that a worry? I don't necessarily believe that it is. I think the TCA as it is well up and running. I think it's really just the bureaucracy of the EU institutions, between the Council, the Commission, and the relevant member states, in terms of making, and the Parliament, bringing those institutions together, and each of those institutions having their own say and view on the TCA as published. It is in effect ratified in the UK, and I don't see much change to the agreement between what we have now and the 1,300 pages that it is, and to the ratification process. We kind of get asked the question, what does the TCA contain, and is it all encompassing? And we would say it is. It's certainly a very broad document, but it's probably skinny in detail, in the sense that there's a lot of areas where there isn't much clarity and a lot of detail around it. And I would probably fair to say that the UK and the EU paid a heavy price for speed here, given, again, in very simple terms, the document was produced over the Christmas period, with it effectively coming into effect at 11 p.m. on the 31st of December. So they're paying a heavy price for speed now, as companies like yourselves, the governments, the customs authorities are all trying to grapple with what this document actually means and to come to terms with how it impacts on various different businesses. In terms of the detail then, I suppose there has been a lot of compromises on both sides. And it's interesting to know why the compromise is taking place and where it's arisen. I suppose from a UK perspective, they've compromised on the deal in terms of sovereignty. You know, the whole idea for the UK was to get a deal, but ultimately protect their sovereignty and have UK autonomy around its decision-making into the future. The EU has compromised in some areas to effectively protect their integrity and the integrity of the EU system, the single market, and the customs union. And they want to effectively signal to the remaining 27 member states that life within the single market and the customs union is better than being outside it. And I think we've probably seen that over the last month or so, and I think we'll probably see it into the future. The key elements of the agreement, and today we'll probably focus more on the trade and goods side, and particularly around customs and VAT. But ultimately, the document, as published, provides for the TCA as a free trade agreement, providing for zero tariffs and zero quotas on the movement of goods between the EU and the UK. Now, that's a very broad statement. It sounds really, really attractive, really sounds positive, but the devil is in the detail. And we'll come to that a little bit later on. I think hold on to that thought as to, does the agreement provide 0% tariffs and 0% quotas? And I think the simple answer is it doesn't, or it does with substantial conditions. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. It provides for governance in terms of how the EU and the UK are effectively now going to live together. We've had the divorce. Now we have had the settled agreement in terms of who has the kids at the weekend, who does what, when, where, and how in terms of the divorce arrangements. No fewer than 20 odd committees have been set up in terms of the operation of the TCA into the future. So that means the EU and the UK are going to have a very strong link into the future. Our economies are very much going to be bound together, and the decisions that each other makes are going to have very strong effect. To draw an analogy in terms of existing agreements, probably the best analogy is to the Swiss agreement, where it operates in a very similar circumstance, where decisions are made very much between the EU and Switzerland, very much on this basis. It provides for a level playing field, subsidy state aid, deals with the controversial area around fisheries, deals with security, obviously very important in terms of the protection of the European Union and its member states, deals with EU programs like Horizon Europe, which is ultimately the research program that the EU member states and EU institutions have in place. And it provides that this, I suppose, document or agreement will be subject to revision every 5 years. So it is something that Brexit is here, but it's here to stay. And it's going to be, I think, a very much a movable feast that we'll be keeping a very, very close eye on into the future. We are in that point now at the moment where we're bedding in, we're getting to know each other, we're getting to know how this works, is going to work. And we've seen some controversies, particularly around Northern Ireland over the last few weeks. So it is a very, I would say, comprehensive document, albeit the devil is in the detail, and we'll talk about that over the course of the next 45 minutes or so.
Okay, thanks, John. That's a great overview. And I think it's clear there is probably a lot more in it than a lot of us are focusing on, because, as you say, we are very focused on the trade side. But if we go to that in a little bit more detail, I mean, we were always talking about day one readiness and, how to get ready for this very first day where we start trading goods. Can you kind of give us an overview of what the key steps are for a company that does want to enter into some cross-border trade with the UK?
Yeah, absolutely. And for some of you, this is our second iteration of this webinar, and I've worked with some of you on the call in the past as clients. I would have always had a very strong mantra in 2019 as we led into the various different deadlines, and certainly into 2020, about what I call day one readiness, the ability of a company to move goods across an international border, and what are the steps that any company needs to do to be able to affect that. And I talked about having customs registrations like the EORI number, a customs agent to lodge the paperwork and the documentation, having a method to pay the customs duty, dealing with import VAT, understanding the rules and regulations around non-tariff barriers. And it's fair to say a lot of companies dealt with that particularly well. And for those of you that have been involved in Brexit preparations, you'll probably attest to, yeah, it's gone quite smoothly. We were ready. We had that checklist well and truly nailed down. We tested our transactions. We knew we could trade. There's a lot of other companies, Roisin, that probably didn't do that, that probably kept their head in the sand, or probably didn't really understand what Brexit meant. They didn't understand that irrespective of a deal or no deal, we ended up with customs controls, VAT, risk of goods being delayed at the border. And I think this has been a very, very big learning experience over the last kind of 6 weeks or so. I think there's a lot of companies that haven't started trading yet. And what I mean by that is a lot of contingent stock was brought in the latter part of last year, which meant, companies were avoiding, and sometimes even at our recommendation, avoiding the UK land bridge, avoiding importing and exporting, particularly in the early part of the year. So they're still yet to face that day one reckoning, which will probably happen over the next coming weeks. What I would say to companies is to kind of look back through that day one readiness. That day one readiness checklist is still as valid now as it was in terms of conversations back in late 2020. So to make sure your goods can cross an international border, we'll talk about the duties in a little while, but in terms of making the formalities, the governance, the compliance around goods crossing borders, that's really, really important. And I talk about it probably through an Irish lens in terms of importing and exporting, but a lot of the companies on the call are moving goods internationally, meaning that the goods may be moving into the UK with responsibility there lying on Irish companies, or potentially moving goods out of the UK into EU markets. So it's really important to understand the supply chain, what's moving, understanding that Brexit is here. It's very much a reality. For some companies, it hasn't been a really good news story. I've various different examples of, trucks being stopped. I had one client stopped for 3 weeks in the Netherlands. I had one stopped for 48 hours because customs wouldn't accept hard paper in Dublin Port, hard copy paperwork, where they requested soft copy, but the documentation was in the truck, and a truck driver stood there for 48 hours. I have an example of a truck that drove around the M50 for 3 days solid because customs wouldn't accept it. He left the port inadvertently, but wouldn't accept it back in, and they didn't know how to regularize the situation. So you have all these examples that are happening. And I think in the UK, it's been very much, relatively straightforward in the sense that they're insisting on compliance with documentation, but the goods are moving through with very little inspections and checks. But that will only happen for a certain moment in time, with the next kind of, I suppose, timeline to be aware of, and in the 1st of April, where those rules and regulations will change, and a further change to happen from the 1st of July. So while people think we might be over the worst, I'm not trying to paint a very negative picture, but particularly for goods going into the UK, we potentially haven't actually seen what the delays might be. So we need to be prepared for that.
Okay, thanks. I think the point is to keep looking at that day one readiness, that plan, and keep updating it. And I suppose learn from events like this and other people's experiences, that you don't fall into those terrible pitfalls that you're talking about there, which nobody wants. So we all just have to keep learning is the point. Speaking of which, Brian, I'd say there's a lot of VAT issues that people have to learn about as well. And the focus really has been on the customs impact up to now. But could you just let us know, and I know the devil is definitely in the detail when it comes to VAT, but at a high enough level, what are the issues that you're seeing on the ground from a VAT perspective?
You're right, Roisin, in that I suppose the VAT has been left behind to a certain extent with all the fallout of Brexit. Possibly this is probably because the likes of the customs documentation and procedures have more potential maybe to cause bottlenecks and have drawn more fire on that basis. But I think there's probably about 3 practical points worth reiterating from a VAT perspective now, and that we've seen kind of pop up again fairly regularly since the 1st of January. Firstly, the supplies of goods to and from the UK since the 1st of January 2021 have been recharacterised as exports and imports, and are no longer considered inter-community supplies or acquisitions to the EU. Now, that's probably the most basic thing I can say about Brexit from a VAT point of view. But obviously, what that does is it creates significantly more documentation around the movement of the goods, which John has kind of alluded to already. It also means that from a VAT point of view, supplies to businesses, business customers in the UK can continue to be zero rated for VAT purposes because exports are zero rated for VAT purposes in Ireland. What it does mean, I suppose, from a very basic practical point of view, is that as the UK are no longer in the UK, it's not a requirement to include the value of supplies to the UK, either those exported or imported into Ireland from there, in VIES statements or Intrastat returns anymore, because they're no longer in the EU, and those are EU returns. Secondly, what I'd say, I suppose, from an administrative point of view, what we're noticing is that although it is possible to avail of what's known as postponed accounting, more popularly known as reverse charge VAT accounting, I suppose, and as I say, even though it is possible to avail of postponed accounting on all imports, not just from the UK, since the 1st of January, many businesses don't seem to be taking advantage of it. The application of postponed accounting essentially means that VAT is not required to be physically discharged at the point of entry or the point of import, which means, of course, that that's a huge cash flow benefit where businesses can avail of the postponed accounting mechanism. I think the primary reason maybe that some are not availing of that mechanism is likely that they either haven't been or haven't instructed their customs agents to enter the specific code on the customs documentation that signifies their intention to apply postponed VAT accounting for imports, which means, as I say, they no longer have to pay the VAT to get the goods out of customs. Should be a simple and straightforward matter to address. Maybe it should be only a matter of talking to your customs agent, or just completing the form and notifying your intention to apply it. What I will say is there are certain conditions to be adhered to in order for businesses to avail of postponed accounting, but by and large it should be available to the majority of taxpayers now. As I said, in the absence of postponed accounting, the importer will be required to discharge the VAT in order to clear the goods from customs, and that will require a cash outlay. I'm also seeing some questions, I suppose, from a very practical point of view around the detail. Where can the detail be found to enable businesses to calculate the VAT that they need to include for postponed accounting purposes? And we understand that under the new kind of AIS system that's used for customs documentation, this information will only be made available to the customs declarant. So in instances where businesses use an agent for customs, they'll need to communicate with them and keep a line of communication open with them on an ongoing basis to ensure that whatever information is produced on the AIS system with regard to the amount of VAT that's due under the proposed postponed accounting arrangement is passed on to the importer. Under the existing AEP custom system, which will be discontinued at the end of March, traders and declarants can access the information to allow them to carry out the postponed accounting on ROS as a SAD downloadable, single administrative document downloadable. And again, that's just something that we're seeing come up in many questions.
Okay.
Finally, from a kind of a compliance point of view, there are changes to invoices and returns that businesses should be aware of as a consequence of the UK falling out of the EU. Return changes, I suppose, will probably present themselves more readily, and obviously next month when the March deadline for filing approaches. In terms of invoicing, as opposed to the UK are now exports, it will not be strictly necessary to include the UK business customer's VAT number on the invoice. It's not an EU supply anymore. It will also no longer be necessary to include a statement on the invoice signifying that the supply is an intercommunity supply and is subject to reverse charge accounting. So those things are quite basic, but they're no longer required. On the VAT returns themselves, it will no longer be necessary to include the net values of supplies of goods to or from the UK in the e-boxes on the returns from 1st of January. So when you file in March, you won't have to complete the e-boxes in respect of UK supplies or acquisitions. But it will be necessary to include a value for the amount of goods that are subject to postponed accounting in the new box on return PA1. And lastly, I suppose the annual return of trading details will also be amended for periods ending after 1st of January to take account of new boxes that will capture the value of goods exported and imported under postponed accounting.
Okay, so there's a lot of detail there in terms of the filing and the administration of it, and yeah, a bit of thought to go into that. And that's really, I suppose, on the Irish side. If you flip this around, Sam, what are the kind of VAT issues businesses are facing when they're importing into the UK?
Yeah, well, what I'd say there is, I suppose, looking towards the potential implications for businesses that are importing into the UK. what I'm seeing or what we're seeing is that issues around who is responsible for the import and and the deductibility of that in the UK. So the authorities in the UK, for example, do not allow businesses that do not own the goods that are imported to deduct import VAT. So what you really want to see there is an alignment of the identity of the importer of the goods and who ultimately owns them. In the absence of that, you could have a situation presenting itself whereby the person who's actually importing the goods won't be entitled to deduct the VAT that's they're required to pay at import into the UK. Another prominent, probably related issue actually is the insistence by some, what we're seeing is the insistence by some UK-based customers that suppliers through them deliver goods to their door, duty and VAT paid. That the prospect of that becomes a little bit trickier when you understand that the UK law obliges businesses that aren't established in the UK or can't use somebody that is established in the UK to appoint what's known as an indirect representative for the purposes of importing goods. And what that means essentially is appointing an indirect representative to import goods on behalf of a business is quite expensive because they're jointly and severally liable for any duty and VAT that's due by the importer. So if the importer doesn't pay it, that indirect representative will have to. And our understanding is that there are very few agents willing to engage in that manner as an indirect representative due to the risk required on their part. The only alternative, I suppose, to this is to push back on the UK customer and insist that they be responsible for the importation of the UK, which is a much simpler solution. So I suppose all in all, we're coming across a number of factual issues, but they can be dealt with and managed, if thought is put into them and enough time is put into that. But it's not ideal if you're attempting to fix something, I suppose, after something has already happened.
Okay. I see a question there. Can a UK company charge us Irish VAT on an invoice and pass this on to the Irish revenue?
Like everything in VAT, it depends. It very much depends on where the supply was due to take place. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that is the case, but likely what you'd want to see there is an Irish VAT number for the UK company on the invoice.
Okay.
That's probably the most basic answer to that question I can give you.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Brian. Annie, we'll move on to you for a few minutes. It'll probably be light relief now after the detail of the VAT, which has to be thought about as well, obviously. Can you tell us a little bit? I mean, we were talking about the fact that the UK is an important market for you. So Brexit has obviously been a big issue for you, Annie. A little bit about what your preparations have been so far. And as well, then, are there any big issues that you've seen since the 1st of January, really?
Yeah, okay, so thanks, Roisin, and good afternoon, everyone. A lot of the points actually that John and Brian raised resonated with me. Going through that checklist is something that we have focused on. I suppose we've been preparing all the way along back from 2018 with all the different start-stop dates of Brexit, and in particular, we ramped up our preparation then since September. So since September, we've been having weekly meetings with all our key stakeholders, the management team and the relevant people across the business who are responsible for different areas in relation to Brexit. And one area that we spent a lot of time actually, and which Brian mentioned there, was looking at company structures for becoming our own importer of record. So we didn't want to have to set up a UK entity to be an importer on the UK side with all the complications that brings. And our customers in the UK are the large retailers who didn't want to take responsibility for the import of our products either. So, we looked at different ways of how to get around that, but in the end, what we did was we engaged a customs agent. So we engaged Jenkinson's, who we had been doing a lot of work with previously, and luckily they agreed to take us on because of our long-standing relationship, and they are completing all the import and the export documentation for us. So we do pay a fee for it, and but that actually is working out quite well for us at the moment. So in addition to that, I suppose another thing that we did in the build up to the 1st of January was we obtained additional warehousing space in the UK. So we built up 2 months worth of stock in the warehouse prior to the 31st of December. So that was to get us around any issues in the initial weeks of trying to get our stock across to the UK. So like the UK it's a substantial market for us. It accounts for approximately 20% of our sales. And one of the key products that we sell over there is our organic oats. So we're the number one branded organic selling oats in the UK market. So that was very important for us to keep our products flowing on that side. So other things that we did then, we set up our UK EORI number, UK VAT registration, our deferred payment account on the Irish side, so that we do actually import some packaging from the UK as well. So we organised with our packaging suppliers to try and get sufficient stock in over across to us on the Irish side as well to kind of deal with that. So our drums, actually the drum packaging that we source from the UK, so we got a good supply of that in before the 31st of December. So other things like we had to get special heat treated pallets which are required for going to the UK, so we had to make sure we had a quantity of those on in stock. We also so we took advice then along the way. We actually we have taken advice from PwC, from yourselves, Brian and John as well, and we've availed of various supports too from Board BIA and from Enterprise Ireland, which have been very helpful to us. And then I suppose in terms of issues then, so from the 1st of January, we sent our first shipment across on the 6th of January. So with that, we sent, our commercial invoice with all the information on it, tariff codes and all that kind of thing. And they seem to have, the first few weeks anyway, they seem to have gone through fairly okay, and not too many checks, but they seem to be ramping up the checks a little bit now. Like for example, last week we had one load going across to Waitrose, and we had a haulier waiting on the other side from 6 in the morning for the load. And we had a slot booked in at Waitrose to bring the goods in for about 11:30. But because of a random spot check, the goods didn't, the haulier didn't get to Waitrose until 7 in the evening. So, that was a big delay. And luckily, like Waitrose took the goods in, but with some customers, you have your booking in slot, and if you don't get there for your booking in slot, then they won't accept the goods. So, with those kind of things we're seeing now, we had a delay then on packaging coming the other way, coming over to us, and that was the 6th load that we had. So 5 loads came across with no issues, and then number 6, they were looking for some additional documentation, which we had to get through. So there was a delay of a day or two there as well. And I think with groupage as well, so where you have some smaller companies where you might be part of a bigger load, if one person's documentation is not in order, they'll hold up the whole load. So that's like another area that's, kind of, you can have delays there. And then there's some changes that still haven't, that are not in place yet. So for example, from the 1st of July, all organic shipments to the UK will be required to have a certificate of inspection. So that's not required for these 6 months, but then for the 1st of July, we'll have additional checks and additional documentation to get, because we'll have to get these certificates of inspection for each load that we send over. So they're kind of some of the types of issues and things that we're seeing with our products going over to the UK.
Okay, I think that's interesting. I mean, because it's obviously going relatively smoothly, and a big part of that is because you had done a lot of planning and preparation, and that just highlights that. But then it does also show that no matter how much planning you do, I think every company will probably have some issues, because there's just some things you don't have control over. And I suppose I go back to John on that one as well, John, because you're obviously dealing with all of our PwC clients, from the big companies to the smaller companies, and the issues Annie is bringing up and what we're talking about, are you seeing those, or are there any other issues aside from the logistical issues, or what are you seeing happening on the ground with our clients, I suppose, in terms of your experience?
Yeah, it differs, I suppose, between the size of the company. In some ways, Roisin, differs in terms of the preparation that they've done. differs in terms of whether it's an import into Ireland or the UK or mainland Europe. We've seen even issues as far wide as Poland and Hungary, where Brexit wasn't really high on their radar. We've seen it in different sectors. So if I kind of give a couple of examples, in the pharmaceutical life sciences sector, it has been relatively okay. Why? Because that sector has only ever seen a hard Brexit. They're planning from absolutely day one from 2016 has been hard Brexit driven. That's primarily from a regulatory perspective, but it's cascaded into all aspects of the business. And if you think about the pharma cold chain and supply chain, no delay is welcome or can be accepted because it compromises the integrity of product. So they've been very much on top of this for very early on. If you go into retail has had a tough time, and you've high street retail and food retail. And they've had a kind of tough time. They operate a GDP model, which means that it's the supplier that's ultimately responsible. And under a GDP basis, that means that if it's a UK company exporting into Ireland, they're responsible for importation in Ireland. So they have to register with Irish revenue. Some companies did it, some companies didn't. And those that didn't haven't been able to deliver to the retail sector. And we've seen that in Northern Ireland, where choice has, and product not being available on shelves has been a big talking point and somewhat of a headline grabber. So, you have certain sectors that are more vulnerable than others. You have then kind of the e-commerce companies, of which there are loads, and we're all e-commerce. I suppose during lockdown, that's one thing we've got very good at, is buying online. But because of that, demand for online sales has gone through the roof, which means that the volume coming through is enormous. But all you need is a 40-foot container with one item in that container that's somewhat controversial, meaning that it needs to be inspected or examined at the port of entry, and that whole 40-foot container then gets stopped. We've seen very silly examples of where, ultimately the customs authorities have been going in looking to a 40-foot container of e-commerce transactions for a live animal, because just the way that the legislation has been written and the codifying and the linkage between Department of Agriculture and the HSE and Customs. So nonsensical stuff like that. But then you have the companies themselves, and companies have to take charge of their own destiny. There has been, and there's no doubt about it, a lot of head in the sand stuff over the last couple of years saying Brexit won't happen, or companies failing to plan for the eventuality of Brexit. So there is companies that can only look to themselves, not having the right paperwork. Annie talked about all the authorizations that she has put in place. Brian talked about the VAT registrations and the complexities that exist there. If you haven't done that basic minimum, really you are facing a delay. And that's ultimately, it's very hard to justify that in some respects, but ultimately that has been the consequence for a lot of companies, that they're facing into those delays and those problems. And that will only continue until such time as somebody troubleshoots and looks at those issues and says, right, how do we resolve them quickly to make sure our goods can continue to move. So it hasn't been plain sailing. I would say very much industry specific, but you have to look at the company themselves to see what have they done, what haven't they done. And, thankfully, there's ways of putting, I suppose, remedies around all those things, but you need to be doing it sooner rather than later.
Okay. Good advice there, I think, John. I do see some questions. I'm going to kind of keep running through our session, I think, and then I'll try and bring up the questions at the end because they may not be relevant for everybody, if that's okay with everyone. John, an important point, and you raised it already, and I just want to go through it again. And that's the point that, supposedly we've got a free trade agreement, and that means zero tariffs. But I think the issue is that that's not actually always the case, and that's a really important point for companies to be aware of. Can you run through that point with us, please?
Absolutely. And during the session so far, I've been very deliberate. Everything that we've said to date has been very much compliance. It's been very much about moving those goods cross-border, the procedural aspects, etc. They apply irrespective of whether duties apply or not. Okay, that's the critical message, and that's why I've tried to keep the 2 points separate. On the 24th of December, as I was looking at my lump of coal coming down the chimney, the media were publicising, this deal as being 0% tariffs for movement of goods moving to and from the UK. And that is right, but the devil is in the detail. And what they miss there is that it's conditional. And, for anybody that would listen to me over the last 5 years, I've been very vocal on this point because I think it was always missed by the media. It was always missed by the commentators. A free trade agreement is conditional on the goods, what we call originating. And originating does not mean shipped from. Originating means that the goods are effectively manufactured in a particular location. So I'll give a couple of examples as to where duties will apply, and more importantly, where they won't. But if you take a dairy product coming out of Ireland, it's coming out of, the cow produces the milk goes into the creamery produces X, and you make a dairy product. It's very clear that that's an Irish or EU product, provided then the EU or Irish company provides what we call a statement of origin, that those goods originate under the TCA, those goods will be imported or can be imported into the UK duty-free. If I take a steel manufacturer up in Sheffield, I don't know, do they still make steel in Sheffield, but for argument's sake, let's say they do, and they make and manufacture and forge steel up in the Sheffield Steelworks, and there's sufficient value added to that steel. And again, the steel forger in Sheffield puts a statement of origin on his commercial invoice, ultimately to the effect that the goods contained herein qualify as originating under the TCA, right? And you provide an authorization number. Then those goods will come into the EU or Ireland duty-free. However, if I take goods from the US, I bring them into Ireland, and I just repackage them, I put a label on them, or perhaps I do nothing at all. They come in on a Monday morning into my warehouse and go out on a Tuesday afternoon. Those goods are US origin goods. While we might consign them from Ireland to the UK, they're still US goods. They will not qualify for 0% treatment going into the UK. Another good example of goods going through the UK that won't qualify. If I take apparel, so clothing, most clothing we wear comes from the Far East, Vietnam, Thailand, China, for example. Oftentimes, and one thing I learned during the Brexit experience over the last 5 years is that Ireland is a stockless island. We don't actually hold much stock in Ireland. We operate a just-in-time stock system, meaning that we often get our goods out of a UK warehouse in Manchester or Liverpool or Cardiff or wherever it might be. So that clothing will go into a warehouse in the UK, let's say in Manchester, for the UK and Ireland market. And 95% of that product will be for the 60 million consumers in the UK, and the remaining balance will be for us in the island of Ireland. But those goods, when they come into the UK, duty will be paid. Duty on clothing is about 12%. Now, that's no different than we had pre-Brexit, because it's a third country into what was the EU. Now it's into the UK, so that duty still applies. But that second movement of goods now has another duty on it, because those goods are still Chinese goods, Taiwanese, Vietnamese goods moving to Ireland. So we now potentially have 24% duty, double duty, on that one piece of clothing, right? Meaning really, really restrictive in terms of the Irish marketplace. Now, how does the company get around that? Well, an Irish company can't do anything because it's the recipient. It's up to the exporter to do something. And the only thing the exporter can do in that instance is put in a bonded warehouse. So what they do is they take one duty out of that supply chain, the first duty, and then they apply a second duty on the goods moving to Ireland. But you shouldn't expect a price increase of 12%. Maybe expect 1 or 2, but you won't expect the 12%. But you're now reliant on a UK distributor putting in a customs warehouse for 5% of the stock that goes to Ireland, whereas they now have to bond 100% of the time, which they've been very unwilling to do. So the Irish consumer is effectively put on risk here. Another example, and Percy Pigs is the one that's been touted around or mentioned in the media, but take a product coming out of Germany that's manufactured in Germany, processed in Germany, etc. It moves from Germany to the UK. It will probably move under the provisions of the Free Trade Agreement. The German manufacturer will provide a statement of origin to say those goods are of EU origin, and they will be imported into the UK duty-free. But when those goods move from the UK to Ireland, that originating status does not follow the goods. They no longer are deemed to be EU originating under the TCA, and duty will apply on the second movement of those goods into Ireland. So even though they were manufactured in the EU and re-imported into Ireland, the fact that they have gone through the UK effectively means that duty becomes payable. That took a lot of people by surprise, and we've been working over the last 6 weeks with companies to put planning mechanisms around that within what the legislation provides for. And thankfully, there are some planning mechanisms that exist, like the return goods relief, or moving your goods through a bonded warehouse in the UK using the transit regime. But you can see here, I've used 4 or 5 examples there, that it's not straightforward stuff. For an Irish company that's selling into the UK, that is, I suppose, declaring that their goods are originating under the TCA, you have to be registered with Irish Revenue, called a REX registration. You need to maintain records, your bill of material, to justify how the goods originate. So you have to show at a line item level that each good originates. each product within the TCA has its own rule of origin that has to be complied with. If you're buying raw materials from an EU supplier, you now have to get what we call a long-term supplier's declaration to show that when you do your bill of material calculation, that the raw materials that you've incorporated are of EU origin. And if you use UK originating materials, you have to adopt a principle called cumulation to assign originating status. And you can see that there's a shift in the last minute or so. Gone very, very technical, very, very quickly. And I'm not trying to make it technical, but I'm trying to, I suppose, point out that it is. And as much as we kind of can try and dumb this down to 0% tariffs, there's a lot of moving parts that companies will need to think about. For an Irish company that's buying product, we talk here more about selling, but an Irish company that's buying product, I would say it's very important to engage with your supply base to ask a fundamental question. Have you qualified your goods as originating? If the answer to that is yes, what products do they relate to? If the answer to that is no, what products do they relate to? And what plans did you have in place to take goods out of the supply chain? Or duty out of the supply chain? Because if they can't, ultimately that cost will be passed on to you as buyers of product, and then, ultimately onto end consumers. So this is end to end. We have a buying aspect to look at in terms of the supply base, but we also have a customer aspect in terms of selling product into the UK market. So both angles need to be looked at. If you're a small SME and you're saying, that doesn't apply to me, then you need to look at who you're buying product from, because ultimately if they're incurring duty, they're potentially going to pass it on to you in your cost of goods. So Roisin, probably could spend an hour on that alone with all the various permutations and combinations that go with it. But just to highlight, this isn't complicated. In fact, this is complicated stuff. And, the 0% tariff headline really is conditional. I think that's the main message to kind of get out from this part of the conversation.
Absolutely. That point of origin thing, you really could cause a really nasty surprise. So it's really important to think about that, I think, when you're thinking about your supply chain, as you say. Brian, if we go back to you on the VAT, are there any other practical issues that businesses should be aware of, and any particular steps that they should be taking to deal with those?
Yeah, I think, Roisin, there's probably about 4 key areas maybe that we're noticing some confusion around the VAT treatment and implications. And these are probably, firstly, as UK are no longer in the EU, again, it means that certain EU-based reliefs that may have been used before, such as triangulation and call-off or consignment stock reliefs, are no longer available. Those reliefs, in an EU context anyway, are generally designed to ensure that businesses are not obliged to register for VAT in a number of EU jurisdictions as a consequence of the various VAT rules that apply to the type of supply you might be engaged in. Ultimately, though, what the removal of those reliefs means is that there may be an obligation possibly for a supplier or any part of a transaction that had used those reliefs or is expecting to use those reliefs. There might be an obligation on those to have to register for VAT in another non-Irish jurisdiction. So just keep an eye on transactions where you might be falling into the thought process of thinking, oh yeah, that'll get triangulation or that'll get call off for consignment stock relief. If it involves the UK, that won't be available anymore. Secondly, I suppose another major point, very important point, is that under the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol, supplies of goods to and from Northern Ireland are still considered to be intra-community supplies and acquisitions rather than imports and exports. So what that means is that supplies to Northern Ireland still need to be captured on VIS and Interstat declarations where they're relevant. And the e-boxes on the VAT-free return need to be completed. Additionally, all the usual intra-EU invoicing requirements, such as the use of a customer's VAT number and statement regarding the application of reverse charge, need to be observed. What I would point out is that Northern Ireland now have a new VAT number that starts with the letters XI. So businesses should be aware that they might need to change their systems to capture that new VAT number when making supplies to Northern Ireland customers. The third thing I've noticed, and I'm going to try and answer one of the questions, Roisin, that was in the chat as part of this, is that business to consumer supplies to the UK, where the consignment is less than £135 sterling, the supplier is now obliged to register for VAT in the UK and charge UK domestic VAT on that supply. So that's just something that's come up. Where the consignment is over than £135 sterling, it falls into the usual import and export regime that we've kind of spent the last half an hour talking about. I just wanted to make that point. Moving on, out of the kind of the Brexit impacts, which is mainly concerned with the movement of goods, I just wanted to make the point that business to business supplies of services to and from the UK since the 1st of January remain largely the same as they would have before then. So Irish suppliers can still zero rate the supplies, as long as they're not subject to various exceptions that are in the rules to the UK and vice versa. And the recipient of those services are obliged to account for VAT on the reverse charge basis. So service is broadly the same, business to business. The last point I just want to make is that VAT exempt businesses, such as those involved in insurance and banking, or maybe exempt financial services, VAT exempt financial services, that are now providing services to UK customers, can consider whether those services are now considered to be qualifying activities. And where a VAT exempt business provides what's known as a qualifying activity, a service provided to somebody based outside the EU, it is entitled to deduct VAT even though their business is VAT exempt. And they can deduct VAT related to the service that they're supplying. So the provision of services by those VAT exempt businesses to the UK now may open up the possibility of a large VAT cash flow benefit for them. And what I'd say is I'd encourage such businesses in that space to review their client base to see if they are providing such services to UK customers since the 1st of January.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. Again, there's a lot in it. The more we go into this, the more we realise, I think there's just so much in it to think about. And part of that, Annie, my next question is for you really in terms of, and I know the chambers are all very keen to highlight to people that there are supports out there, there are grants available. Can you just tell us a little bit about what grants and kind of training supports or skill nets or any kind of support that you would have availed of in terms of upskilling? Because it really is an important point, and everybody doesn't know everything as yet. There's still more learning to do here for everybody, I think, no matter what stage you're at. So just in terms of what supports you would have availed of.
Yeah, so Enterprise Ireland and Board B were quite helpful to us. Back in 2018, we engaged in Act on Brexit sessions with Enterprise Ireland, which were kind of useful in our initial planning stages. And then one of our staff members did the SkillsNet Customs course. That was funded by Enterprise Ireland. That was under the Clear Customs financial support. So at the time we had been debating whether we were going to do the customs documentation in-house or whether we were going to go with an agent. And eventually we went with the agent, but we're not ruling out the possibility of, once things settle down and we get more familiar with it and we get the software that we could get the software ourselves and then use our own employee in-house to complete the customs documentation. So that's an option as well. We worked with Board B on their Brexit barometer and customs readiness program. And then over the last few months then, especially from September onwards, we've been working with a consultant, and for that we've received a grant from Enterprise Ireland, Enterprise Ireland Brexit consultancy grant, and that funds 50% of the consultant's costs. So the consultant has been attending our weekly meetings and giving us a lot of useful advice along the way. So that was a good help for us as well, especially in the run up to the 31st of December. So so I think there are some really good supports out there, and it's useful to clarify things, and it really helped us. And also I would mention that we did get advice from Brian and from John as well at various times during the process. So that's all been very useful for us.
Okay, great. Thanks a million. John, and I know we're kind of getting close to our time, but as I said, we could keep talking for ages. But one important point here is that the whole, a lot of focus on the deal was between, the EU and the UK and trade between the UK and the EU. But for us in Ireland, obviously the Northern Ireland question is a big point. And I think, there was an intention to retain an open border on the island of Ireland, but there have been issues, as you said earlier, there's been issues in recent weeks. Can you talk to us a little bit about trade with the North and what the issues are?
Yeah, again, you probably need a session in Northern Ireland on its own, and it's just proven quite difficult, Roisin, in some respects. They have in effect created a border between their biggest trading partner, which is GB. And that's where the difficulties come. Thankfully, trade with North and South, for the intent of the Northern Ireland Protocol, it has worked quite well. Goods can move quite freely north to south with no difficulties, no compliance, no paperwork and no tariffs. And that's for goods that are staying, that's important, staying on the island of Ireland. We'll talk about goods leaving in a second. But ultimately, goods coming into Northern Ireland, when they arrive, you have a customs declaration that's required. And what the legislation provides for there is that the importer has to make a declaration as to whether the goods are at risk or not. If the goods are at risk, it means that they're at risk of moving to the Republic, and then duty becomes payable then at that stage. There's some slight variations in that, but by and large, duty then just becomes payable. But that's very difficult if you're in Northern Ireland and you're running a island of Ireland business, where you supply both Northern Ireland and the Republic, meaning then that you have to, in effect, pay duty on 100% of product that's imported, and then look for a rebate at some point into the future based on product that remains in Northern Ireland. Now, that might sound, well, okay, yeah, we can work on that basis. The problem is, even at this stage, the detail as to how that rebate is going to work actually hasn't even been published. So you have companies paying duties unaware as to whether they're ever, when and how they're ever going to get that money back. You also have a situation at the moment where, when making that declaration in terms of goods at risk, you have to be an authorized trader, and to be an authorized trader, you actually have to have a premises and presence in Northern Ireland. Now, that's somewhat impractical for a lot of GB suppliers who their main course of business is in GB, not Northern Ireland, and they sell in, and we use the term again, on a DDP basis to the retailers and to their customers. So that becomes problematic. So there's a lot of issues that we're, as a firm, working through with HMRC to understand the practicalities into the future, how this will work and how practically it will work. Because the legislation was published quite quickly, quite rushed. It's full of contradictions, just like probably Northern Ireland itself. And I don't mean that in any way flippant remark, but it is full of contradictions. And the open border is a contradiction in itself, between goods moving between east and west. So there's a lot of detail, Roisin, if I'm asked, to be worked out. When we get a query in Northern Ireland, the first thing I do, and I say to my team, is take a deep breath, because we're entering into a territory that we're not familiar with, because it's new legislation, it's a new way of governing customs control that has never existed either in the UK or in the Republic. So we do take a deep breath, look at the legislation, the supply chain, and the facts of the transaction very, very carefully before we look to see how this is actually going to work.
That's
mainly a GB to
is probably go through the legislation, but there are complications there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a million, John. Annie, I suppose I feel like it's hard not to be kind of overwhelmed a little bit by all of the information and all of the things that we're trying to take in here today. But I think a really important point, and what I want to talk to you a little bit about, is just the UK market generally. I mean, it's a massive market for you, and I think you are taking on this challenge of Brexit. You're going to get over these issues, and you're going to continue focusing on the UK. And I think that's a really, we tried to make that point the last time as well in our last session, but the UK market is still a really valuable market for Irish people. And, just if you could talk to us a little bit about that and what your advice would be to companies who are considering the UK market in terms of starting or growing trade with the UK.
Yeah, so like we're still optimistic about the UK market. For us, there's still plenty of opportunities. They're our closest neighbour, and we're, as I said previously, we have 20% of our sales currently are our sales to the UK. So it's a growing market for us as well. So we're seeing even in the last 6 months, we've seen significant growth in that market, with good sales and distribution in the retailers. So we're in like Waitrose, Sainsbury's, Tesco, Morrison's and Asda. And, our organic product is doing very well over there. So we have significant growth targets for the coming year as well. So I wouldn't say we're not daunted by Brexit or anything like that. There are some additional costs, but I suppose we have to take that into account and weigh it up as well. And so like I suppose I would say for anybody going into the UK market, like it's still it's still worthwhile. It's a very important market for Irish businesses, and I would say it will vary by category and what category you're entering into. And I suppose I would recommend planning really around it, and looking at your margins, looking at your costs, and factoring in the extra additional costs from Brexit. So, you know, taking that all into account in your decision. But yeah, you know, I still think that there's plenty of opportunity there. Yeah.
Okay, great. And I see a question. I might run through a few of the questions and then let John do a bit of a sum up of the issues in terms of moving forward. But one of the questions that I've received is there any insights into changes needed on food labelling of goods exported to UK retailers? Have you seen anything on labelling, Annie?
Yeah, well, just on labelling, we have one sort of issue that we're working through, which is we import some organic oats from. Previously, we have imported organic oats, so the raw oats from the UK into Ireland, and for our organic product, because we get all of our conventional oats from our local growers, so that's all bought within Ireland. But with the organic, there are not currently enough organic growers in Ireland, so we have to usually source out a portion of our UK oats, and previously we would have got it from the UK, but going forward, that's going to require a change in our on our packs. So instead of being able to say that our oats contained in the packaging are of EU origin, now because it's coming from the UK, we would have to change the packs to say that the oats are of EU and non-EU origin, which doesn't really give the right message to consumers, because we're saying that the oats are, if you're saying non-EU, the consumer doesn't know where they're coming from. Like, they could be coming from anywhere outside Europe, but because it's you can't put GB on it, you have to put from EU and non-EU. So we're kind of working through that one as to whether we can source organic oats from elsewhere, like from the Nordic countries or elsewhere, or because we don't really want to change our pack to show that. But
okay,
yeah,
so obviously it is an issue. The labelling of foods is going to be an issue. Yeah. Okay. John, there's a question there. I don't know if you've seen it. If I import goods from a UK supplier and I get audited by revenue, what proof do I need to show revenue that the goods are UK country of origin? Do I need a certificate from the supplier?
Yeah, so the only way you can claim preference, as we call it, when the goods are imported, is that the goods are accompanied by a statement of origin, not just goods RGB. There's a specific wording in the TCA. It's when the customs agent then picks it up, then they'll apply 0% duty on it. So the first thing the auditor will look at is that statement provided by the supplier or not. If that statement hasn't been provided, well, then ultimately duties become owed, and you as an importer then are liable for that. If that statement has been provided, ultimately then the customs officer will see, based on the type of product, the sector, and their own knowledge, do they get a sense that that product is in fact of GB origin or not? If they have any doubt over it, what they do is, under a mutual assistance arrangement, then engage with HMRC, and HMRC will then go out and audit the supplier. If it's found that the goods don't qualify, then you as the importer, and to Dennis to ask the question, you as the importer, Dennis, will ultimately be liable, even though the mistake has been made by the supplier. So your only recourse then against the supplier is a commercial one, where ultimately, they're not going to be in good favour with you, I would have thought, and whether you try and seek to recover duties paid because of effectively an error or a misdeclaration that they've provided you. So something you need to be very, very aware of. You need to know your supplier. You need to have faith and confidence and trust that the declarations that they make are accurate and correct.
Okay. And another question, John, I don't know if you know the answer. Does anyone know when customs will start inspecting pallets on exports going to the UK to see that they are heat treated? Department of Forestry say it's not a priority yet. Heat treatment packing is almost twice the price of regular wooden packing.
Yeah, I would say at the moment when they mightn't be checked, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't comply. That's the critical thing, because you never know when that pallet will be stopped or inspected. So while checks are quite low at the moment, it doesn't mean that companies can effectively flout the rules and ignore compliance. You have to be compliant 100% of the time. That's really, really important. But I would say if the inspections aren't occurring now, from the 1st of April onwards is probably a good line in the sand, as regulations from that date onwards are going to get a lot stricter, and HMRC have been very vocal that, it's business as usual from then on. Now that might change, and we'll see what happens on the ground. But we are hearing anecdotally, it's not very easy to get product into the UK, but they're not as stringent in terms of the checks that the EU customs authorities, the remaining 27, are actually undertaking.
Okay. Thanks, John. Brian, there's 2 VAT questions. I think you may have answered some. Have you have you seen those questions?
Yeah, I answered the one about the B2C supplies.
Okay.
You can. The B2C supplies. So yeah, that's just, if you're making a supply of goods business to consumer, consignment is less than £135, you have to register for VAT and charge UK VAT.
Okay.
The second one, I think, then is about the VAT number in the UK.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that the one you're seeing? Yeah, okay. So is there anything to be said for applying for UK VAT number? It's hard to be definitive for such a question, but I suppose the suggestion is that you have a choice. You may not necessarily have a choice. If you're importing into the UK and making a domestic supply in the UK after that importation, you will not only should you apply for a UK VAT registration, but you'll have to. So it'll very much depend, I suppose, on the arrangements with your customer as to who's the importer into the UK and whether or not you should have a number. In terms of the advantage, you're asking about the advantages as well as part of the question. It's only an advantage if you consider having 2 registrations at the same time being an advantage. And I'm not trying to be smart or evasive. Quite often that would be a deterrent to people. But if there's a commercial benefit in terms of agreeing a certain import arrangement with a customer, then obviously that would be the big advantage. But it's hard to read between the lines as to what exactly the circumstances in that case might be. But hopefully I've given some sort of a sense of what the UK VAT registration position might be.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. I'll do one more quick question. Brian, read the Northern Ireland VAT number is changing to starting with XI instead of GB. Can customer records be automatically updated, or should this be confirmed with the customer first?
In theory, they can, because the number after the letters won't change. But for the sake of it, unless you have an astronomical number of Northern Ireland customers, I think it probably would be worth just confirming with them that they have updated to XI. And what you don't want is to change your system to XI and realize that for whatever reason, they haven't. But I would expect that they would have a new XI number. But probably worth a check if it's not too much bother.
Okay. Listen, we've gone way over time. There is loads to talk about. I suppose, John, really, if you could just sum up what the key takeaways are from the session and what are the hints and steps for all of our Southeast businesses in this new post-Brexit world, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe just to sum up, I would say Brexit is here to stay. Unfortunately, it's the reality that we all have to get used to. Compliance is key. Day one readiness continues to be a key step that any company should follow and be conscious of and be aware of. And I think Annie gave some really good examples as to how her business is prepared and continues to prepare for this new normal. Costs are not gone, and Brexit does not eliminate costs. And I think you need to be really conscious of it in terms of goods that you're supplying and goods that you're purchasing to and from the UK and within your supply chain. Brexit does provide opportunity. It's not all negative, albeit I probably haven't given huge amount of optimism and positivity in what I have said, but it does present an opportunity. You get this right, you continue to be in business. UK continues to be a market, and ultimately, if you can qualify your goods as originating, your goods are cheaper on the UK market, and you need to look at your competitors to see how they're placed, and can you get a competitive advantage over them by way of geographical location, etc. So I think that is key, and let's not forget that there is positivities to take out if it's done right. And I think the last point would be, this is a complicated area. Brian, Annie, and myself have all kind of talked through some of the complexities that existed, and we could probably talk about 20 more if we had the time. But don't be afraid to ask for help. Annie gives some really good examples of helps that are out there from Chambers, Enterprise Ireland, and other organisations. Don't be afraid to ask, because if you don't, there's a real risk of getting this wrong, and that could be worse than not asking for help at all.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks, John. I'll wrap up because we have gone over time. I think it's great to end on a positive that this is manageable and it's doable, and it just needs a bit of an investment of time to get into the swing of it. I just want to wish all the businesses in the Southeast the very best of luck dealing with it. And as John said, if there are any queries, there's loads of support out there. You can drop me a line and I can put you in contact with Brian or John if you have specific queries. Massive thank you to Annie Flahavan for taking the time to join this discussion. I think that insight into a real life business story is really helpful to everybody. So thank you very much. And as well, absolutely massive thanks to all the chambers who, as I said, to Waterford.
Gone on mute, Roisin.
Sorry, was I on mute?
You just went briefly on mute, yeah.
Briefly. So did you hear my thank you anyway? I'm just thanking everybody, thanking the speakers and wishing everybody the very best of luck into the future dealing with Brexit and every other business issue. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.